The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Hey, it's Tony Mecia with the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. You can find out more about the Charlotte Ledger at thecharlotteledger.com. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger Podcast is presented by South Park Community Partners, an independent nonprofit organization whose mission is to lead South Park's advancement by driving economic vitality, creating memorable experiences, and ensuring an extraordinary quality of life. Visit southparkclt.org and follow South Park Community Partners on LinkedIn and on Instagram and Facebook at South Park CLT to learn more about the ways South Park supports the Charlotte region's economy. I'm talking today with Shannon, the founder and executive director of Sustain Charlotte. It's a nonprofit organization that advocates and educates around issues like sustainable development, smart growth, transit, and other urban issues. Shannon, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Tony. Great to be here.
Well, I'm really excited about talking with you about this topic. I'm really interested in what you're doing and in your perspective. The Charlotte Ledger, one of the things we really try to cover well is this topic of growth and development. And that's been a big theme in Charlotte going back decades. We're a growing region.
Absolutely.
There are a lot of positives in being a growing region. There are a lot of advantages to that. There are also some negatives in that. And this question of how our region grows is just absolutely vital. And I know there are different ideas on that. What is your idea of how Charlotte should grow?
It's a great question, and it's really the reason we exist. I moved here in 2007, noticed exactly what you just described, this incredible growth, but also a lot of the negative impacts that come with that growth. So, the idea of this organization and what we're really focused on is how can we grow in a more sustainable way? How can we grow in a way that is better for the long term? Not just looking at maybe what's best in the short term from an economic standpoint, but economically, environmentally, and from an equity perspective, what does growth need to look like? So, we're focused on decisions and policies around land use and development, much like you guys are at the Ledger, as well as transportation, how we move around the city and the region. So, for us, it's keeping in mind the long term. What do we need to do to have a healthy, a safe community, a vibrant economy now and into the future, and really a place that is livable and affordable for everyone, just some of us.
So what's the Cliff Notes version of how you do that? As a region, how do we grow more equitably? How do we make sure people have affordable places to live? How do we make sure we have the lifestyle that people want as, lots of people pour into this area?
Yeah. So I think, what we really need most in terms of making the area more livable, more affordable, more convenient to move around is we need diversity. We need diversity of housing types. We need smaller housing types like apartments, up to single family homes, and all the different housing types in between, what's often referred to as the missing middle housing. By providing a variety of housing types across the community, we're able to provide affordable price points for more people, given that, people have a range of household, family incomes. Similarly, we need a diversity of transportation choices. Kind of in a similar fashion, there's on the one extreme, in the extreme that we've been most focused on, like most American cities, is assuming everyone will want to and be able to get around with a private car. But we need other transportation choices because, frankly, private cars don't work for everyone. Not everyone has access to one, or has the ability to use one, or frankly wants to use one. So, at a very high level, I think when we and other cities grow in a way that prioritize a diversity of housing, diversity of transportation, and build our communities in a more efficient way, that's when we move in a more equitable and environmentally sustainable way, and a more economically sustainable way.
Well, great. I'd love to drill down on these a little bit more. Maybe let's start with transit. I know that's something you've been very involved in, and a lot of times when people think of transit, they think of light rail or they think buses. And I know that the vision for that really is a little bit broader. Bike lanes and greenways and sidewalks. What's become sort of known as multimodal or a mobility plan. Certainly, Charlotte has been talking about it, certainly, and has a lot of ideas about it over the last few years. And at the Ledger, we started a newsletter in 2021 called Transit Time, and we did that with WFAE and UNC Charlotte's Urban Institute. And at the time, the thinking was, okay, the city's getting ready to really move this transit plan forward. It can go to a vote this year.
Okay.
And we need to kind of step up and cover that. That was 2021. And 2021 passed. There was no vote, didn't really move forward. 2022 passed, 2023 passed. We're now in 2024. And it seems like in many ways, like we're no farther along in getting to that comprehensive transit plan or mobility plan than we were 3 or 4 years ago. Is that frustrating? I mean, should people who want to see that be frustrated, or what's the right way to think of that?
It's very frustrating. Much like you, we did some things in 2021 to kind of prepare for what we thought would be a 1 cent sales tax, moving ahead and being on the local ballot for voters to decide whether they want to increase their taxes to support transportation investments. And yes, it's been very painful to see that not go forward each year since then. And, even prior to 2021, going back at least as far as 2015, our Metropolitan Transit Commission convened a transit finance working group clear back then, and, recognized at that point that we needed major sources of additional funding to carry out our transit plan. So we've been paying attention since before 2015, but certainly this is a conversation that's dragged on for a long time, with kind of the most recent iteration being the 1 cent sales tax that started to come forward in 2021.
So what needs to happen for that to move forward, and why hasn't that moved forward, and why is that important to move forward?
Why hasn't it happened? I think that really comes down to the fact that we have not, been able to build either, both the robust local support as well as the support in the state legislature that's needed to move that ahead. I think, at the local level, I think everyone knows that part of the transit plan for our region included a rail line to the north of the county through Cornelius, Huntersville, and Davidson. And because of a broken agreement, essentially, with Norfolk Southern, who owns those tracks, that project has not come to fruition, not for lack of trying, certainly on Kat's or Charlotte's part, but that hasn't happened. And therefore, residents and town leaders in the north have felt they have not received what they were promised when they started paying into the half-cent sales tax a couple of decades ago. So that's been part of it. And then I think, in a similar vein, we've seen the legislative leadership not be supportive, at least in rhetoric and what they've said publicly, in a plan that would be multimodal for our region that does involve expanding transit, walkability, bike lanes, greenways, and so forth. So there's a lot of politics involved, but at the same time, I believe that there's a good chance something will move forward this year. I think there's a lot of work that is being done and underway to both, craft an agreement at Norfolk Southern to use those tracks, but also I think efforts to work with the leadership in Raleigh to really make the case that, from an economic standpoint alone, this is a really important investment that we should allow residents here who pay taxes to make a decision on for themselves, and at least give us that opportunity to decide if that's what we want to do.
So what is the case for moving that forward? It has a lot of moving parts in it. I mean, the most expensive part of it is the light rail. I think it's a 13.5, the last numbers I saw, 13.5 billion, and light rail, the rail portion is, I think, 8 plus. There are also, sidewalks, greenways, more mobility types of things. What is the case that actually needs to get done? Like, why does that have to happen?
Well, the reality is we are a fast growing urban area, and urban areas around the world, and a reliance solely on moving people, or primarily moving people in vehicles, cars and trucks, simply doesn't work in urban areas. It works in rural areas. It works in, places, lower population centers. But as areas become more populous, become more urban, because of limited land availability, it's sort of the simple question of there's only so much land, but cars take up an enormous amount of space on a per person basis. So your streets can only be widened so much before you start to run into other things like houses and buildings and parks and things that people need to get to. And transit, walking, biking, these modes are just simply more efficient ways to move people from that land, use perspective. Not to get too wonky, but you can just visualize how much space you need to move, 10 people on a bicycle versus 10 people in a car, or 100 people by car versus 100 people on a bus. So that's why cities, in urban areas in general, move to other transportation modes, simply because without doing so, you have major gridlock and no people and goods cannot get to the places that they need to go.
Yeah, I mean, these things are all kind of tied together, the transit and transportation and land use. I mean, how much, this is a city that kind of grew up around the automobile. And if you look at our development patterns over the last few decades, we have a lot of single family subdivisions out in the suburbs. And if that weren't the case, you think of the older cities, your Chicago's and your New York's, where the transit lines, work pretty well. How much is Charlotte hampered by the fact that we are so spread out, and that we have, those density numbers are, they're pretty low, I think, relative to other cities. We're geographically one of the larger cities. I mean, how much does that kind of make that effort tough?
It makes it really tough. I mean, we are one of the lowest density. I think one study considered us the lowest density major city in the world. It does make it difficult because in order for walking and biking and transit to work, you have to have, a certain level of density. Things have to be somewhat close together. It is difficult to efficiently and affordably provide transit service across a 300 square mile city. And that doesn't include, the entire county that CATS works to serve and partner with. So it's a challenge, but, the reality is land is being developed all the time. Cities by their nature are always changing, as you know. So we have this opportunity as redevelopment occurs to redevelop in a way that makes these other modes of travel more possible. So it comes down to really better urban planning and in many cases, higher density development, but not just higher density of one type, but a mix of land use types. So mixing housing with businesses, with grocery stores, the village concept. That type of thoughtful planning allows people to get to the places they need to go more easily without having to drive a long distance. So the neighborhood is built with sidewalks, bike lanes, good bus service, and the places they need to go, the destinations are relatively close to each other. Then those modes become much more viable and make a lot more sense. But yes, as you mentioned, the historic pattern that we and many other Sunbelt cities, who grew up during the age of the automobile, have done, we've grown these subdivisions that are very reliant on cars. And it is difficult to retrofit, but it's not impossible. And we see other cities around the country who are in a similar place, fixing it. It's not easy, but it does require changing development patterns and changing what types of investments we make when it comes to transportation. So with roads, it doesn't mean we don't do anything new with roads. It means that we redesign our roads so that they are safer for people not driving as well as walking, biking, using transit, right? So there's investment in roads are needed. Just the shift is cities are really moving away from building for a single mode of travel, i.e. cars, and building what are called complete streets. So people have multiple ways of moving within the corridor of that road or that street.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like one of the issues on this transit plan is that, most of the local leaders, not 100%, but most of them, I think, are on board with this idea of what you're saying of multimodal options for people, 10-minute neighborhoods, that kind of thing. But then, the folks in Raleigh say, we need to focus on roads because 90% of the people drive cars and we need to service, and then the traffic is getting worse and we need to take care of the people who drive cars. Like, what's the matter with that way of thinking? Is that accurate, or what would you say to people who say, okay, we need to look out for the interests of people who are driving cars?
Intuitively, I think a lot of people do think, gosh, if there's a lot of congestion on the road, we just need to widen the road. But what happens when you do that, when you widen a road or add more road capacity, it actually attracts more drivers. So people tend to drive more. The faster the traffic is moving, the easier it is. So it doesn't provide that long-term congestion relief that you intuitively expect when you add road capacity. The opposite actually happens. You may have relief for a very short time, but invariably that extra capacity is absorbed by new drivers, especially if you're a growing city attracting more and more population. So you only buy yourself some congestion relief for a short time, and then things are worse than they were before. In addition to the fact that Unfortunately, that solution does not solve congestion, which is what is most people's primary concern. That approach doesn't address many other issues that cities need to be concerned with. Equity, for one. It doesn't take into account the fact that here in Charlotte alone, 13,000 households don't have access to a car, and about a third of Charlotteans can't drive. So when you design a city for a single mode, you're really leaving out many, many people where driving is not possible for them. From a climate perspective, we are still driving around. Most of us have many fossil fuel plants under our hood. We're burning gasoline, which of course is emitting greenhouse gas emissions. And here in the city, transportation is the largest source of climate pollution or greenhouse gas emissions by sector. It's 40% of our emissions. Regionally, it's 44%. Another downside of just building more roads is that when we do that and we have that heavy reliance on vehicles, we also run into a lot of health problems. The largest source of air pollutants in Mecklenburg County is from vehicle tailpipes. You also, in communities where people are unable to move through active transportation, walking, biking, even if that's walking or biking to a transit station, you find higher levels of obesity and heart disease and diabetes and other chronic medical conditions that, sitting in your car a lot can exacerbate. Last thing I'll mention is just from an economic competitive standpoint, only focusing on building cars has done a number of things. One, many employers are now looking to locate in cities that have diverse transportation networks and in multiple ways for their employees to get to work, in part because it's the quality of life issue. And they know that people want to live in walkable, bikeable, transit-rich communities. So it's important from an economic competitiveness standpoint that we don't just limit ourselves to building for cars. We also know from a 2021 study that was done here in North Carolina about our plan was that if we don't do anything, if we just kind of continue to grow in the way we have grown, we could lose up to 126,000 unrealized jobs, 28 billion in economic outputs, and 3 billion in tax revenue by 2050. So I know that's a long list, but the reality is we tend to think about, we just need to fix congestion. And unfortunately, not only does it not fix congestion, it a lot of other problems. And I didn't mention safety. The number of fatalities and serious injuries that exist in a city like Charlotte that is really focused on moving cars as quickly as possible results in a number of people. Last year alone, 70 people were killed due to traffic violence. I think this might be the highest source of death outside of homicides in Charlotte. So there's a lot of reasons why we have to look beyond just moving cars around our region.
We'll be right back to the conversation. But first, this episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast is presented by South Park Community Partners, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to lead South Park's advancement. Yeah, you hit on a lot of interesting points there. I mean, you think where employers want to locate. I mean, if you look at where all the hot office buildings are now, they're in South End, right? Along the light rail line, because that's where employers want to be. It's sort of, and you think about a walkable, I mean, there are a lot of amenities there. And this idea of the office park is kind of now considered, well, it was hot 20 or 30 years ago, is now sort of a little bit outmoded. That this idea that you would drive to these huge surface parking lots, park and walk into a sort of sterile office park with nowhere to go for lunch around it is a little bit antiquated. So you're seeing things all around the city and really all around the country in urban areas trying to kind of tap into that a little bit. And so it's a little bit of a question of how do you make that happen writ large?
Right. And also realizing so many cities are so much further along than Charlotte, especially when you move beyond the Sun Belt. In terms of these other ways of getting around, we're competing with the cities for talent, right? For people. And, I think for people who are used to those sorts of cities where they have, things within walking distance and they can ride their bike and they can hop on a greenway and they can use transit, if they come to visit Charlotte, or even move here, that's going to be a barrier for some people. It's not a small factor anymore. I think people do care about those issues.
You also mentioned the development patterns around roads. It's funny. My wife and I were cleaning out our attic the other day, and I used to worked for the Charlotte Observer, so I saved some old, remember newspapers? I used to save an old newspaper when it was my first 1A headline about a bus hijacking. But the rest of the stuff in there was interesting. It was a 6-part series the Observer did in 1997 on I-485, and it's called I-485. Here it comes. And it's, it talks about how he used 3 million tons of asphalt and concrete to build it. Before it opened, really. It said, looked at some of the pluses and minuses. Commuters who now drive 30 minutes to work can cut their trips in half. Residents of towns outside Charlotte will gain easier access to the stores, restaurants, and theaters around the region and the city. Farmland, once populated by cows and corn, will soon disappear. It turned into 2-car garages and 24-hour grocery stores. And it says, but it's not without a price. Some fear more air pollution, heavier traffic congestion, more suburban sprawl with fewer human connections, the end of a quieter, calmer lifestyle. So even, in 1997, some of these things were kind of recognized a little bit. And if you look at, one of the things that the House Speaker was complaining about is the interchange at 485 and 85. And, these issues just sort of, they don't go away necessarily because you build a big outer belt.
No, I mean, that's just it. We've known for a long time. And, we can look at our own experience like you just did. The predictions in that article from 1996 have come true, I would argue. But, you can look at so many cities around the country and around the world who have taken the approach of, well, we can just pave our way out of this mess. And it's never worked. They've always ended up back where they were with just worse congestion and wider roads and a lot of asphalt they have to spend a lot of money to maintain.
On land use, I know you all have been involved on the Unified Development Ordinance and the Charlotte 2040 Comprehensive Plan. How do you think that is going? I know the city's, starting to operate under these new rules. There'll be some modifications coming and they've already made, but how would you describe that process and where we stand on that?
Yeah, well, it's exactly like you said. I think, the city's learning a lot, as they implement the new rules around development, the UDO by development ordinance, discussing some changes, some unintended consequences that have popped up. But, I think still fundamentally it's a set of rules that is vastly better than what we had before. The comprehensive plan envisions a very different city than what I think we've articulated in the past. So, it'll take time. I mean, it will take a lot of, I think, political will to honor those rules and to honor the plan. We know that, rezonings are the idea, right, with the new comprehensive plan and the UDO is that we would, reduce the number of rezoning requests because we would be allowing, more flexibility in the law. And I don't think we've seen that yet, but I think that was the ideal, is maybe raise the design standards, but provide more flexibility and more reliability so developers know what they can build. So I think, it's too early to say, but, we believe in those plans. We believe in the plan. We believe in the rules. And now it's a matter of, implementing those rules and making changes as needed. But fundamentally, we think that we're on the right track.
One of the things, as that was one of the main areas of concern when it was passed was this idea that they're going to start being non-single family homes in neighborhoods that are right now composed almost entirely of single family homes. And, and I think people understand the, concerns about gentrification, housing prices, that sort of thing. What would you say to people who don't like the idea of duplexes or triplexes, being built in their communities?
Well, yeah, there's certainly a lot of that. And I think the reality is that, when someone decides to move to a city, one thing that, I think we fail to keep in mind at times is that the nature of the city is that it's always changing. Cities are not static places. If they are, they're usually dying or not growing economically. So, when a city is successful and vibrant, then there are changes. And when you choose to live in a growing city, you have to expect that you're going to have more neighbors. People have to live somewhere. And for reasons we talked about earlier, there's a lot of benefits to increasing housing diversity and having various price points, different sizes of homes, and having a mix of rental as well as owner-occupied homes. we need to have homes for everyone. Not everyone can afford a single family home, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be able to live in a particular city or a particular part of the city, especially if that's where their work is or their child's school. So, I think there's an equity component to this about allowing people to live close to their work or, the part of the city that they want to live and work in. But it also is the practical reality is when you have, over 100 people moving to this area a day, they have to live somewhere. And, putting people further and, just building single family homes on the outskirts of the city is simply, not sustainable. We will run out of land for that. And we will continue to create this dependency on automobiles, which then leads to the congestion that we're now suffering from. So I think you have to really look at how all of that comes into play. And, if people say, I don't want more congestion, you can't say you don't want more congestion and then sort of be in favor of suburban sprawl, because suburban sprawl is a recipe for more congestion.
What sort of things Sustain Charlotte working on nowadays? I know it seems like you always have sort of regular events, panels, discussions. What sort of things are on your radar for the rest of this year?
Yeah. So, we're working on all these things, keeping a close eye on the sales tax and continuing to be an advocate for that. But we're also, right now, we have an effort where we're engaging residents and helping them use their voice to advocate for more funding for Park and Rec. Park and Rec, we believe continues to be underfunded relative to community needs across the county. So we're simply asking for more funding for land acquisition, which the county's done a great job of the last 2 years, putting aside $50 million for land acquisition. We were asking them to continue that again this year. That's to buy land for future parks and greenways, nature preserves. Also just increasing the amount of staff that the department needs to grow as the need for more Park and Rec facilities grows, things like that. So we're kind of in the midst of a campaign, if you will, to secure Mecklenburg County Commission support for funding for Parks and Rec. We're also starting to look at best to ask the city to increase funding for their bicycle program. The city has what they call their bike program as well as their pedestrian program and their Vision Zero program. These are all attempts to make improvements to the street network for safer walking, biking, and in the case of Vision Zero, driving as well. Those are funded through the city's CIP. And for the next 3 bond cycles, the funding for Vision Zero and the pedestrian program are slated to go down significantly from the last bond cycle. And bicycle funding remains flat at just $4 million per year. So we'd like to see the bicycle funding go up from $4 million a year to $10 million a year in the CIP. And again, this becomes especially important because, the sales tax has not moved forward. Our needs around making our city more multimodal have only grown, and yet the funding for these additional modes, namely biking and walking, have decreased in our future plans for our CIP, for our bond. So we'll be making an ask for the city to consider increasing at least the bike program funding, and hopefully restoring higher funding for Vision Zero and the pedestrian program too.
So if somebody is listening and likes what you're saying, what is a way for them to get involved with Sustain Charlotte?
So lots of ways. Of course, we have a website, sustainCharlotte.org. And when you land on there, you can sign up for our newsletter, which goes out once a week. And that's filled with information as well as ways to get engaged, opportunities to be more involved in these issues and weigh in when the city or the county is asking for input on plans and policies. Of course, we're on all the social media handles or social media sources as well. So you can find us on all of those on X and Facebook and Instagram, of course, and YouTube. So lots of ways to get involved. And we try to share those opportunities quite frequently, how people can get involved, whether it's signing a petition or, engaging in an activity, coming to an event. We've got our sustainability awards coming up in April, our 12th annual. So we're seeking nominees right now for our sustainability awards. And then we've got lots of other events throughout the year that they can find on our events page.
Great. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you think is important to know?
Well, I think that one thing I was going to mention around other policies we might want to consider, we one thing we might also be advocating for later in the year is for CATs to have the financial and human resources to restore the frequency of bus and streetcar service that were in place prior to August of 2022. You might remember that frequency on about a dozen routes was cut, and they're bringing back that frequency, but it's being brought back slowly. And I think a lot of it has to do with the driver shortage. But that's getting service back to at least those levels is something we'd like to see. Service levels need to be improved even further, but if we can at least get back to where we were, prior to 2022, that would be good for people who are using our transit system today. And the other thing I just mentioned is at the state level about Highway 521 in Ballantyne and the transportation, the STIP, the Strategic Transportation Investment Law. Back in 2013, the legislature put a restriction in that law that does not allow standalone bicycle and pedestrian projects to be funded by the state. Localities cannot apply for state funding for bike and pedestrian standalone projects. And we'd like to see that restriction repealed because that does, really put all the burden on towns and cities to come up with the funding for those projects.
Oh yeah, I think wasn't there one going through University City where the city actually stepped up and paid some money, or maybe it was University City Partners or somebody, and they had to step in and actually do it because the state won't do sidewalks and exactly. In urban areas, in high, where there are a lot of pedestrians.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what I was referring to. So, that's just a state level policy. That the big state level policy change, of course, that we want to see is the authority to give ourselves the chance to vote on a tax. But, a secondary one would be, repealing that restriction to open up more state funding for walking and biking infrastructure. And that's across the state, of course.
Great. Well, that's all the questions I have, Shannon. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, that's a wrap. To our listeners, thank you for listening. Charlotte Ledger Podcast is produced by Lindsey Banks. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger Podcast was presented by South Park Community Partners, a nonprofit who leads South Park's advancement by driving economic vitality, creating memorable experiences, and ensuring an extraordinary quality of life.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com